Welcome back to the BHF Boardroom series. I'm Matt Hughes, founder of Accommodate Consulting and creator of the business of hotel franchising, maximizing performance and profit. If you've been following the series, you'll know we've been working our way through the different levers that shape hotel performance, from operations and organization design through to brand and leadership. Today, we're turning our attention to a part of the commercial engine that's often talked about, frequently misunderstood, and rarely examined in the round: group demand. I'm joined by Dan Humby, Vice President of Global Sales at Groups 360. Dan sits right at that intersection of hotels, buyers, distribution, and technology, and has a front row view of how group business actually behaves in the real world. Dan, great to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Matt. Good to be here.
Absolute pleasure. Lovely to see you, as always. And before we dive in, let's start with a bit of context. For operators listening, how do you describe your role and what Group 360 actually helps hotels do better when it comes to group demand?
Yeah, great way to kind of tee this up, really. And I think additional context before that, my background is on the hotel side, about 20 years on the supply side, about half of which was on property, a combination of heading up sort of sales and events teams. And then the last 10, 11 years or so within, a worldwide sales division, leading corporate and group sales teams before moving on to the intermediary side. So spanning both business, travel and group. So that's the background perspective that I've got. But to answer your question, in my current capacity, you actually framed it quite nicely there. I manage both the supply and the demand side of the business. So typically, most of my work sits at a chain level, managing our chain relationships with the global brands. But that vantage point, it gives me kind of a cross-property, cross-brand view, as well as managing the demand side of the business. So, we have two customer bases, the suppliers and also the buyers. Across all spectrums, really, any buyer with group demand is a customer to us. So we're agnostic about what particular vertical they're from. But yeah, I've also got that cross-buyer view, if you like, of how group demand behaves in the wild, let's say, how buyers are searching and shopping. So I guess my lens on this one personally is not necessarily how should hotels sell groups, but it's more about looking how group demand sort of flows through the market. And what does that ultimately mean for operators who are trying to run, profitable, resilient businesses? So that's kind of my personal perspective, a little bit of what I do, in my day-to-day role. Groups 360, we were originally sort of a startup. We're into our 12th year now, really trying to simplify the way that group travel is transacted. So, big focus for us is on technical integrations to bring a lot more transparency into the group selling process. So real-time visibility of availability and pricing. We essentially want to help buyers move from search to decision-making much faster and remove a lot of that noise from the process, really. So rather than just being about volume, we want to really help hotels compete on, their relevance rather than just relationships, because it is a segment, let's not get away from it, that has traditionally been very relationship heavy. And I'm sure we'll kind of unpick that a little bit as we go through.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's evolved so much since I was as close to the group side of the business with your good self. But one of the reasons that I wanted to have this particular conversation is that group business is often described in a very simplistic terms, stabilising, lower yielding, good for base occupancy. From your perspective, Dan, how should operators really be thinking about the role of group demand today compared to 5 or 10 years, or as you say, 12 years ago when Group 360 started? What's changed?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot that's changed, not necessarily, in the immediate past, but if you look over the course of the last really 5 even 10 years, I think one of the biggest changes is that meeting planning it's become a profession, and the buyers that we're now engaging with, they're very sophisticated from a commercial perspective. They know how to benchmark, they know or are employing folks who know how to negotiate, to instruct those concessions, how to leverage their scale. A lot of what you and I would have seen on the business travel side of the business going back many, many years, group has always lagged business travel in terms of maturity, but that's really come to the fore in recent years. So the folks that we're dealing with are now more like travel managers than that traditional image of an event organizer. And obviously that's segment specific. But yeah, if you look at the corporate space, that's become very, very true.
Oh, that's interesting you say there about being a profession. I remember at the time, people, especially in the States, you'd see people with CMP qualifications. You're like, okay, certified meeting planner. All of a sudden, it is a profession, and definitely a shift into the procurement side of the thing. Coming under the umbrella of procurement, which it's such a big segment.
Yeah, and that leans in quite nicely to my next point. You look at enterprise accounts and how they're managing their group business. They're maturing. They are centralizing, standardizing, they are negotiating at a portfolio level. So there's ways that's good and bad. That does bring more structure with it. So there's a bit more predictability. That's good, but it does put more pressure on margins. They are leveraging their scale and their ability to centralize and steer volume. So naturally, they're going to leverage that to their advantage. We said it there. Group travel is going through what transient travel went through long ago. Consolidation, digitization is something maybe more of a recent trend, but it is happening faster. So I think that's one aspect of what's changed. If I look at through a more operational lens, I think one of the big trends in recent years, it's been very prominent here in the UK market. Hotels aren't just competing with hotels any longer. There's been this appetite to, find non-hotel venues, spaces that, they offer a lot of character, a lot of story to them.
Something
novelty.
Different.
Yeah, very much so. People don't want to be within, that very traditional image of a meeting space. And so that raises the bar for operators around delivery. It also puts pressure on owners to make sure that they invest, that they're being more creative, and there's a continual evolution of what they can offer. So, they're now competing on experience as well as having to manage margin and absorb all of the complexity and maturity that I talked about earlier. So yeah, a lot to contend with, I would say.
Yeah, completely. And I guess there's a bit of a cycle, isn't there? Everyone wants something new and different, and there will be a move towards spaces rather than hotels. But then they get there, and maybe the service delivery isn't as good as it would have been at a hotel. And you've got to then bus your people across town, which, brings its own challenges. So it's cyclical, I could imagine.
Yeah, it is. I've almost contradicted myself because a lot of what I talked about early there, leveraging your spend and consolidating spend to certain brands. Well, that is one of the big advantages that the bigger brands have over maybe smaller independent venues or non-affiliated hotels or venues. So yeah, there's kind of, arguments to be made for both there. But, you said earlier about kind of grouping, having this perception as being more of a stabilizer or a lower yield. I think it's so critical. We're not just judging group business on, average room rate, because it is a total revenue segment. And not just the obvious things like, F&B spend and room hire. You've got to look at, the extended length of stay that you might be able to capture, impression on shoulder nights, how are you leveraging ancillary spend? So there is a lot more complexity, but also opportunity that exists around group business.
Yeah.
So.
And I think as I talk to my target audience of owners, I would imagine a lot of owners there don't know or really care that much about group business until it's not in their hotel. And the impact of that is obviously significant. Where do you most often see group demand misunderstood when it's discussed at that sort of owner or board level?
I think if you're talking about it from kind of a margin perspective, I think so often I see occupancy as being the driver, the prioritizing factor, rather than kind of efficient revenue. So it's all about, let's fill that space without fully understanding, what is it that business is displacing? What are the true costs of being able to deliver and execute on that operationally? So I think, again, kind of blending into the previous answer on that stabilizing point, I think that can be a bit of a dangerous generalization. Some group is genuinely based business, but quite often it can be quite volatile. It can be quite operationally heavy. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I would issue a note of caution as to how operators and owners are treating group. There is a huge amount of data at their disposal now, historical data, forward-looking data. So making sure you have the right mix of events, making sure it's well revenue managed, that, it shouldn't just be about stabilizing performance. It should be, a revenue leader for you. And it should drive total hotel revenue, should drive repeat business, strong length of stay, as well as giving you the opportunity from an operational perspective to really wow your customers and deliver that kind of operational excellence, so to speak.
And of course, there's different types of groups, aren't there? You could be a big box, and of course, group business is your bread and butter. But even your 150 bedroom hotels with those small incentive groups, it can have a massive impact to your quarter, to your year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I know we are generalizing a little bit in this conversation because, yes, to your point, hotels run the gamut in terms of how critical group is to their business mix and the opportunities they've got to make it potentially a bigger part of their mix. That's not going to be relevant for every hotel. We talk about group very broadly in this conversation, even, up until this point. But, is it our group rooms only? Is it a combination of group and event space? The dynamics of business change by geography. So, here in Europe, because, locations are more accessible, we see a lot of more day meeting business where it is meeting space only, less group business. The dynamics of that over stateside are very, very different, where typically concentrations of groups are traveling across country from one market to another. And so that mix of rooms to space ratio becomes very, very critical there. So yes, acknowledge we're making generalizations here. It's going to look different for every property. And I talked about that lack of maturity. To some extent, that's very evident. You and I have worked in properties where that's very evident, where they're very mature and have been for a long period of time. So,
Sure.
I guess we have to caveat everything we're saying to that,
No,
that generalization piece.
It's interesting, and again through an owner's lens. If if they're building a hotel or they're taking over a hotel, having a good understanding of that is essential as you're maybe designing that hotel or that flow of business, of understanding what is available in your market and what the needs and demands of that target demographic is. You mentioned a moment ago that there is this long-standing narrative that group business is lower margin but necessary. Where does that still hold true, and where does it break down once you factor in distribution costs, staffing, space utilization you mentioned, and operational complexity?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and one we should probably spend a little bit of time unpicking, because I'm going to pick up particularly on your group distribution piece there about the transparency of group distribution cost, because I do think it's one of the most misunderstood parts of group distribution. It is also one of the areas where group is a lot less mature than other segments, where distribution and technology around distribution has really matured significantly across the years. Group is still just not at that level. But if we talk about the cost of group distribution specifically, it's really important that when operators are not just looking at commission, but their total cost of both acquisition and delivery. In this region in particular, third parties dominate group distribution. And I will say they're absolutely
is that still
partners.
The case? I know it always used to be. That's still the case. Yeah.
Broadly speaking, we'd say about 80% of business, certainly in the UK, but more broadly Europe, probably 70, 30, right? 75, 25 is coming through group third parties.
Okay.
First and foremost, they are absolutely critical partners if you want to be successful in the group space. I want to be absolutely clear about that. But I often think, and you and I have seen this, there's this badge of honor almost in being the hotel or the brand that pays the highest commission. And what that does, it sets a dangerous precedent. It inflates expectations. And I was going to say it quietly erodes margin over time, but it's not necessarily, there isn't necessarily anything quiet about it.
No, I was going to.
But the first point I make about, commission is only one part of the cost of acquisition. And you've still then got, that's before you factor in the operational burden, the labor costs, space displacement, the complexity of what you might be trying to service. All of those impact profitability. So concerns me when commission becomes that primary decision lever. And the reality is, where group is very unique, is commission should only really be a factor if all things are equal. So, the space and the layout of that space, the attendee flow, the location of the property, the experience, the brand value that might be associated with that. it is so rarely the case that you can put two offers side by side and say, yes, they have all of that, certainly as far as more complex meetings are concerned. So I guess my message to operators around this point would be, you have to start pricing with profit in mind and not just conversion. That will ensure you're building more of a sort of sustainable group strategy, and you're not just simply buying volume, which is what we've seen over the course of time.
Yes. Well, as you say, every group is different. Every hotel is different. And I guess that's one of the reasons that the group segment maybe lacks its on the evolution trail versus transient, because you can't simply commoditize a group. It's very different to every other group. It changes so much over time. When it comes to distribution,
absolutely.
What do operators most often misunderstood about the true cost of group business, and how does that misunderstanding affect commercial decisions?
Yeah, so I think I'll kind of lead in on the point I was just making there about, total cost of sale, but specifically total cost of acquisition. So commission is just one piece of that, but you've got to look at the cost of your sales engines in order to convert that piece of business, as well as going on the cost of operating that business, the cost of your concessions. So, we'll come on to talk about how maybe sales and operations can work more closely together to have a more robust understanding of profitability. But I think that cost of distribution, it's not so transparent. It's one of the issues that exists within the group segment is, it's not as transparent. And so often the appetite is, let's do everything we can or anything we can to convert this piece of business. And more often than not, that's throwing more money at it. You have to price with profit in mind. Otherwise, it's a very dangerous path to go down, I would say.
And I guess sometimes from, senior leaders, owners, there can be a knee-jerk reaction, because if they've suddenly a big gap opens up in their calendar and they're like, right, we need to get this. But, group business doesn't work like that. As we know, that there's a massive lead time. And if you are then just to pay huge commission to secure something, it's really a race to the bottom, isn't it? Yeah.
It is a race to the bottom. And I think it's the precedent setting as well that's dangerous, because that might be a real, it might be a real need to fill that hole and to drive that short-term return. However, you have to consider what that's going to do down the road for you, because the very next time that agency, that client's going to book you, you've just given them more and more leverage for that next negotiation, I would say.
Exactly. So technology, let's talk a little bit about that, because it's often positioned as the solution to a lot of these challenges. Where do you, especially coming from Groups 360, where do you see technology genuinely improving visibility, access and conversion for group demand? Where does it simply just add noise?
Really fair questions. This is very close to my heart, as you know. Technology. We've said it already. Group lags in terms of maturity, and that is no more true than as far as technology is concerned. If you think about the way technology applies today, it's one of the only major products, not just hotel products, where kind of digital discovery exists. So you might shop online, but digital purchase doesn't, and that is the right approach for complex, high-value, high-touch groups, but not for transactional ones. And I would say one of the trends we are starting to see, or have seen a shift in recent years, is that is starting to change for that transactional group demand, and it's a really important shift. I'm a firm believer that, I think you mentioned transparency there, or visibility. The right technology should enable that shift that I'm talking about to more digital kind of purchase, because it introduces transparency at the point of sale. We now have the ability to present real-time pricing for group, real availability, real constraints to what that availability might look like. And so that's where we're helping buyers make decisions faster. They're making decisions with more informed information, and it's creating a sort of a pathway to the lowest possible cost of sale for that right demand. I would take that a step further and say that even for larger groups, the more complex type that I referenced there, who aren't going to book online, that same visibility still matters, and technology can enable more of that visibility. So one of the things we're doing is actually exposing total hotel availability. So group planners are no longer having to source blind and spray their request out to tens of hotels, because they've got no idea who can accommodate their group. We are actually now presenting real-time availability at point of sale before they've even sent that request. So they can be much more focused in who they're sending that to, a much more qualified lead. I would say they're all really positive steps. I think you're asking about where it can just create noise. And I think, when technology has a habit of adding steps, not actually removing them. And that's when it really becomes a distraction.
Well, that's it. If it works and it's frictionless, then, that's what people are looking for. In the past, there would be so much duplication because the lead would be coming through lots of different channels, slightly different because it's gone through many desks and iterations. And if it's a long way out as well, so many things can change, so many dates and locations. But one thing that you mentioned there that was particularly interesting to me, when you're talking about real-time availability, I suppose, that's easy for the booker, that's easy for the third party, but I guess it probably puts the hotels in a strong position as well, because from a negotiation point of view, they can see what's out there, and then the buyer has to make a decision, and they think, okay, this pricing is now realistic about what's available in the market. So that's pretty strong.
Yeah, it is. And I would say the balance from a supplier side and an operator side is bringing that efficiency without making them feel like they're relinquishing control. That's still their inventory. They should be able to price and yield that inventory as they would normally. So that's a real fine balance in rolling out some of this technology that I've been talking about there.
Yeah.
The technical side of what we're trying to do is really complex, takes a lot of time and investment, but actually the biggest challenge is changing behaviors. And that's changing the behavior of suppliers and, how they distribute their content. And it's changing the behavior of buyers and how they consume that content. That's actually a bigger challenge than the technical side, which with enough time, energy and money, you can do anything. But the changing behaviors is fundamentally a different thing.
I imagine when you've got companies like, the big consultants, the big banks who are constantly meeting, and the kind of meetings that are almost transient because they're, there's a group of, 20 people and it's a small meeting room, it's a larger meeting room, and we do these all the time and it's pretty, they're the same. I guess this solution works really well. And then you build on the learning curve that comes with that to get to those more complex groups.
Yeah. It should be about freeing up what sales resource you have to sort of focus where they can have the biggest impact and where you want them. Often the costs of servicing or acquiring a smaller piece of business are just as big as they are for a larger piece of business, but obviously the return is significantly smaller. So focus your resource where it can add most value, I would say.
Exactly. So since the pandemic, buyer behavior has clearly shifted. What has fundamentally changed in how group buyers search, compare, and commit? And what assumptions from the past no longer hold?
Yeah. So it actually picks up quite nicely on that last point I was making. We talk about efficiency. Without doubt, and this isn't, this was immediately post-pandemic, teams are a lot thinner, both on the buyer and the supplier side. Everyone's doing more with less, even, a few years on now. So there is a lot more internal pressure on buyers. And so more than ever, speed and clarity really matter. Not just response times, we've been saying that forever, but response quality, response completeness are now absolutely critical. And we hear it day in, day out. It is one of buyers' biggest frustrations. You might be responding quickly, but unless you're responding, in a complete manner, it means nothing.
Yes.
And it's not because buyers are impatient, but they are stretched, and so they need to work as efficiently as they can.
Do the tools, does the technology control that? Sort of, fields that mandate your responses in a certain fashion and so on. You can't progress until this is finished. But then you are getting apples for apples because everyone has to fill out the same fields. Does that exist?
It does. When you are, one of the challenges we've had is we've worked to make it really streamlined at an operator level. So when hotels are responding, they're doing it all within their native systems, and you are then bound by the capabilities of that native system. So unless you can mandate that field be completed in their tool, then how that interacts with a third-party platform may vary by brand, by hotel. So I would say that's a challenge in trying to make things easier for the supplier. Also, you are often bound by the limitations of what that technology can do. But yes, ultimately technology should enable more robust responses and more, I don't want to say more templated responses, but we should be able to pull in core content. So, we've been linking in with the big brands' content management systems. Anything that's
Yes.
essentially information off the shelf, that should be easy. And we should be able to take that off sellers' hands so that they can focus on a really bespoke proposal on the elements that matter to that meeting.
Yeah, I guess with the big brands, you've got the APIs, and that'd be a lot easier. It's when the independent or the smaller franchise hotels that maybe don't buy into the bigger systems. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so. I guess before we leave that one, in terms of what's changed, I think certainly at the corporate enterprise end of the market, there is a lot more sensitivity to risk. Contracting has become more complex. It's a lot more, it is negotiated. Every contract now, every major enterprise has got their own set of terms that they want to mandate. And that puts a significant burden on hotel teams, whether that's a property, an operator level, or at a chain level. And you and I have seen this firsthand. Realistically, the chains are only dedicating that legal resource to negotiating and agreeing on terms at an enterprise level with a very small core group of elite accounts. So,
right.
I guess when people say be easy to do business with, it sounds like a really obvious statement, but it's incredibly powerful if you take it seriously. Yes, being adaptable on terms brings some risk with it, but balance that risk with sort of the commercial realities. Don't just be fast to respond, be the first to respond. But if you're going to do it, make sure it's comprehensive. Otherwise, it means nothing. And lead with best value. Again, these are all things I feel like we've been saying for years, but where buyers are more constrained, you shouldn't be making them work to discover why you're a good option for them, I would say.
I think it's one of the things you said that got me thinking. It'd be really interesting to see how the evolution and implementation of artificial intelligence at brand level evolves the legal process around group contracts. Because you say the bottlenecks, sounds like it still exists, where you've got maybe one paralegal working on something and you've got to wait for that person to become available. But it's all about risk, and there's managing and mitigating risk. And if an AI tool which learns where the company or where the hotels are comfortable with that risk can make quicker, more informed decisions, I think that would be an interesting area for the future. Okay,
absolutely.
Dan, a lot of group strategies look good on paper, but then they possibly fall down in delivery. Where do you most often see the operational reality undermined what was intended commercially?
Yes, I think where a lot of group strategies fall down is in that handoff from sales to operations. It's been said forever and a day, sales sell the dream, service the nightmare. And I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but the reality is most sales teams are still measured on top line revenue. Operations are the ones that really truly carry the cost of that complexity, whether it's the labor, the setup, the tear down, those service levels, the last minute changes. So I think that the most effective group businesses I see are where the sales team are in lockstep with their operators, their catering teams, and they understand the true cost of servicing different types of groups. They know where the margins actually live, where those staffing costs can spiral and get out of hand, and where the complexity creeps in. And that does something really subtle. It changes how they price, it changes how they negotiate and how they structure deals. So yeah, I think in summary, when sales operations are aligned around profit and not just revenue, not only do you get better decisions, you get better experiences, and the long-term economics are also improved as well. So yeah, that's, it's a rarity, but seeing sales and operations in lockstep is just it's a subtle but fundamental shift for a business, I would say.
So that's a good point. And for anyone who has booked a meeting and knows that, you build that great relationship with the salesperson, then all of a sudden they're gone. You've got an events person, and, that might not be as strong. Build on also what you said about also in lockstep with revenue management. If you've got revenue management, sales, and events all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet, then you're going to get close to delivering on what that customer's expectations are, and possibly secure that business going forward. So I mean,
yeah, definitely.
Dan, you've got a wealth of experience, and you hear from, you're talking to all the different parties involved here. But if you were advising an operator today, what questions should they be asking about group demand before signing off on a commercial strategy, but often don't?
Yeah, I think it's a great follow-on from, that last one, really. Most group decisions or group strategies, they're not necessarily sales decisions. They are operational, they're P&L decisions, really. So it's about shifting that mindset to not necessarily just selling more. It's about choosing better. And This is why I don't think the most important decisions around group are necessarily commercial in the traditional sense. They are more operational, is the reality. So once you get to that mindset that, profit is either created or destroyed in the delivery and not necessarily in the proposal, it does change the kind of questions that operators might need to ask. So it shouldn't just be, can we sell this, but should we sell this? Shouldn't just be about filling rooms, filling meeting space. What does it actually do to our business when it actually arrives on property? So I would say, a lot of group business looks great in reports, but it's not all group demand is good demand, I would say. So just, having that mindset is really critical, I would say.
Yeah, you don't want to be busy fools. It's great to be full and so on, but then next week is dead.
Very easy.
Was that the right decision? For so many people to have so many peaks and troughs. You obviously want that to try to be as consistent as possible. Look ahead a few years. Where do you think hotels will stop? What do you think that hotels will stop doing in group sales and distribution because it simply doesn't work anymore?
I guess a cautionary note to begin with. I think when we're speculating about what's to come, I think change certainly at scale doesn't happen in a single moment. It is iterative and no more so than in the group space. So I look at each year as kind of a stepping stone rather than this overnight revolution. Groups 360 is a good example of that. We've been working to change both buyer and seller behavior for about 12 years now. We've made real progress in that time, but we've definitely seen it is iterative. Every year you're evolving further. And I think that the same applies at the hotel level. I think to that point, a lot of the change we're going to see is actually behavioral. And I talked about this a little bit earlier on. So one of the things we see is hotels almost accidentally training the wrong behaviors in their customers. And so we see real life examples of this every day, and it's alarming. A planner might make a booking online. There is no human touch to that booking. It is the lowest cost of sale. The customer has already got a high degree of confidence that hotel can execute because they've booked it. And yet that booking lands at the hotel and they call the customer to offer them a better rate. So, that naturally teaches the customer that don't trust the price. Yeah.
It's going to call
genuinely happens week in, week out. Yeah,
that's a bit like guests still going
decisive in booking.
It's like the guest still going to the desk looking for an upgrade. It's the same thought process, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have trained customers, and that's an extreme example where they're getting a definite booking and calling to negotiate on it. But we also see that when hotels have trained customers to pick up the phone, have a conversation with their trusted sales advisor, because it'll get £10, €10, $10 off the room rate. Happens every time. And so we have to build this trust and confidence in customers if we want them to behave differently. And I do think we are slowly seeing that message come through. And, the brands recognize some of the efficiencies, things like, digital transactions can offer. And so they're trying to incentivize customers to book through those channels because it's the most efficient channel for everyone. But, that kind of behavior, layering manual effort on an online booking, that's why group is so labor intensive. So I think stop undermining your own channels, don't reward indecision, and start sort of reinforcing the behaviors that you actually want. So I think it is a behavioral thing. Technology will naturally evolve. Said it a couple of times, behavior is the true game changer, and you've got to incentivize the right behaviors.
I mean, everything is digital, isn't it? And sales offices have changed. You used to go into a hotel sales office, it'd be very vibrant, lots of people talking on the phone and everything. But this generational shift, everything is online. And so, it's all done through chat and calling somebody up. The reality is that phone call probably won't be answered. It'll all go through the digital channels. But look, that's for another day.
Yeah.
We're pushing. There's some really good content here, Dan. I wanted to close with a few quick ones, if I may. What's the biggest misconception about group business?
I might have said this one earlier. I think all group is good business. All group business is good business. Not always true.
It's a bit like PR.
Simple as that.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah.
Don't they say the inverse is true of PR?
Yeah. What's the best example you've seen of group demand done well?
Oh, goodness. I again said it earlier, where sales and operations are truly aligned around profit and not just revenue. So I said it earlier, when they're in lockstep, it is a a subtle but fundamental shift to how the business operates, how group business is priced. Coming from a sales background, it changes your mindset as a salesperson. And you also have the trust of your operators. If you know how their side of the business operates, where their costs sit, you and I have sat in countless meetings with head chefs where you've got torn a strip off because you've done X or Y. If you understand their perspective, how they're running their side of the business, it just makes such a difference to how you're presenting where you've got flexibility.
100%. And it's a subtle change, isn't it? And it could be in older buildings, big group hotels, that it's just not possible to have your events office and your sales office on the same side of the hotel. But I suppose then Easy Solutions then is about those regular meetings, those regular interactions, face to face or digital, but just to have that joint narrative, that joint approach. What's one habit hotels should probably unlearn?
Negotiating almost by default. I think, again, it's almost ingrained in salespeople that they feel they have to negotiate to win the business. But, if you've got that context of pricing confidently with profit in mind, if you are confident in your proposition, if you've got a good understanding of what's going on in the market, be confident in your pricing and know that putting your best offer forward first time can often be the key to winning business. You don't always need to leave yourself room to negotiate. That presents risk to whether you can win that piece of business. So, be confident. Don't always negotiate by default, and might be surprised by the results.
And that's a strong message, and you've got to have that confidence. You've got to know that you're happy to walk away from it. That's your price. That's great. Yeah, it's not arrogance, absolutely, but that is the right price for the business. Yeah. Okay.
That's it. And, we talked earlier about having confidence in, the group demand and what you might be displacing. Having all of that data, having a good understanding of the dynamics of your market and your hotel will help you make those kind of decisions.
And as you say, we live in a world now where we have a lot of data. So it's been able to interpret that data and use it as a tool. Dan, look, that was really practical and grounded. Lots of great advice there. Thank you very much. What stands out for me is just how much value operators can unlock when group demand is treated as part of a broader commercial engine rather than a standalone function. I've linked Group 360 below for anyone who wants to explore the work in more detail. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next Boardroom Conversation.